What we saw last week was Jonathan experiencing a small victory, only to make matters worse, really, like kicking a beehive and a swarm of angry bees comes out. The Philistines rallied a giant army that overwhelmed the Israelites' own numbers. This so terrified the Israelite soldiers so much, they started to abandon their king left and right, and some of them even surrendered to the Philistines and volunteered in their army instead. In the end, Saul was left with just about 600 men, and this is where we meet Saul this morning. The end of chapter 13 that we started with in our reading builds tension so that we can see just how desperate the Israelites were for a mighty leader to save them. Chapter 13, verses 16 to 18 tell us about how the Philistines were organized in their newly assembled army, how they created a detailed plan to wipe out the Israelites. They split up into 3 divisions to surround the Israelites and overwhelm them on every side. Meanwhile, verses 19 to 22 tell us the Israelites were living in great poverty under the economic control of the Philistines, in fact. They had no weapons for themselves except for King Saul and Jonathan. They had to go to the Philistine blacksmiths to even sharpen their farming tools at incredibly inflated prices. All of this left the Israelites in a great dilemma, and King Saul had no idea what to do. What about for you? When you're in a great dilemma, what kind of decision maker and planner are you? Are you the kind of person who needs to know all the details before you can make an iota of a decision? Or do you not need many details, just enough, and you're willing to pull the trigger? Well, I wonder if there's anyone here today who's in this third category of the crazies, who don't need any information. They're willing to just jump into something head first. Earlier this summer, I was able to practice and learn this middle ground as our family went to Disney World with a party of 13 people. When I began to research how to plan out your Disney trip, I was quickly overwhelmed with all the details. Which kind of resort to stay at? What meal plan options should we get? What's the bus schedule? What are the stroller regulations? How much are lightning lane passes cost? What are the height restrictions again? Is Henry able to go on this with us? But I knew I couldn't just wing it, though, as tempted as I was just to not make any plans at all. I couldn't just wing it without any details, knowing that we would just get crushed waiting in lines for hours if we didn't have a plan. I had to learn how to have just enough information to get going. Not too much, but not too little. King Saul and his son Jonathan were both dealing with the same Philistine problem. Yet, they had completely different approaches to how to make a decision. Jonathan makes a plan without much support, while Saul sits around, though he has everything he needs. Look back at verse 1 of chapter 14. It says, that same day, Saul's son Jonathan said to the attendant who carried his weapons, his armor bearer, come, let's cross over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. However, he didn't tell his father. Jonathan doesn't wait around even for a moment. The same day that the Philistines gathered their forces around them to unfold an organized plan to wipe them out, Jonathan takes action even though he has almost no support. First, we've been told he's the only one next to his father who actually has a weapon in all the Israelite camp. Second, Jonathan doesn't enlist the help of a special team. He only has his armor bearer with him. The only details Jonathan has are the kinds of details that would convince most of us to do what Saul did. Nothing. Yet Jonathan makes a plan without much support. In contrast, his father, King Saul, sits around even though he has everything he needs. Look back at verses 2 and 3. Saul was staying under the pomegranate tree in Migron on the outskirts of Gibeah. The troops with him numbered about 600. Ahijah was wearing an ephod. He was also there. He was the son of Ahitub, the brother of Ichabod, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh. In light of the cultural background of the time, the picture of Saul staying under a tree indicates that he was there giving and receiving counsel, kind of like the way military generals might set up their tents in the field. He had about 600 men, which, though small, was 598 people more than Jonathan had. And actually, 600 is double the amount that Gideon had a few generations earlier, when he only had 300, and yet the Lord brought great victory through them against the Midianites. Saul also had the council of the priests, who were mediators between the Lord and his people. They had their priestly vestments, which the Lord had given them, just for moments like this. We learn later at the end of the chapter how the Ark of the Covenant, which is the most holy artifact signifying the Lord's presence among his people, it had been brought out to them just for this occasion. While Jonathan has little support, Saul has everything he needs. Yet Saul sits here taking no action until he hears that the battle has already gotten started without him, and so he's caught scrambling, rushing around in great panic reaction. Well, what makes the difference in a person's life? What makes the difference between someone who might anxiously sit around, though they have everything they need, and another person who courageously makes plans, even though they have little support? For Saul and Jonathan, the difference that day was found not in whether or not they had faith in the Lord, but what kind of faith in the Lord they had. It wasn't whether or not they believed in God's existence, but whether or not, but what it was they actually believed about their God. The very first line of chapter 1 of his book titled The Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer writes this: "What comes to our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." What comes to our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And why? He goes on, because we tend by a secret law of the soul to move toward whatever it is our mental image of God is. In other words, what we think about God completely shapes the direction of our own life and how we make decisions. Do you realize how significant this is? What it is that you think about God. Not whether or not you think about God, but what it is you think about him. What do you think God is like? Do you think the Lord is just waiting and watching for who messes up next so that he can judge them? Do you think the Lord is pleased with something as simple as seeing you mow your lawn? Or are things like that far too little for him to be concerned about? If you wanted the Lord's help, do you think you need to catch him on a good day where his schedule isn't too busy? Or do you think you'd find him already on top of things? What do you believe about God? What he is like? Well, you don't have to explain to me what you believe about God, and I don't have to explain to you what I believe about God. Because our lives will tell everything we need to know. The way we live our lives provides all the explanation we need. What we say we believe about God is one thing, but sometimes our lives actually tell a different story. Whether you realize it or not, the way you live your life reveals what you truly believe about God. What we see specifically in this passage, 1 Samuel, is that what we believe about God completely shapes the way we respond to overwhelming problems where we don't know what to do. The storytelling mastery of this narrative doesn't just show us how Saul and Jonathan responded completely differently to the same problem, but how what they each believed about God made all the difference. And this is what Jonathan believed about the Lord. The climactic verse of this passage, verse 6. "Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Here, Jonathan exemplifies what an angel told the prophet Daniel. When Daniel was being told about a future time of hardship and persecution for God's people, the angel told this to Daniel: "With flattery, a Greek tyrant king is going to corrupt those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and take action." What kinds of people are going to be strong and take action in Daniel's day? The people who know their God. Far from counting the numbers of his army compared to the Philistines, there was only one person Jonathan was concerned was present, and that was the Lord. As long as the Lord showed up, he knew the battle could be won regardless of the circumstances. This kind of reminds me of Playoff Jimmy. It's a popular nickname for an NBA player named Jimmy Butler of the Miami Heat. And this nickname comes referring to his exceptional performance and often dominant performance in the playoffs, even though he's never really noteworthy during the regular season. This nickname gained prominence following his historic 2023 playoff run with the Miami Heat, where he led his team, who was the lowest ranking team in the playoffs, to defeat the highest ranking team in the playoffs in the first round. And he even led the team that year all the way to the NBA Finals. Because of this, people started to believe things like, does the regular season even matter so much? Who cares about the regular season? As long as you can squeak into the playoffs and you have Jimmy Butler on your team, Nothing else really matters. Sure enough, we don't really know anybody else that's even on his team. He doesn't have much noteworthy players around him, let alone do they have much accolade that season. But we got Jimmy Butler, so we have a chance. What kind of problems are you facing right now in life? And what does your outlook on your situation reveal what you believe about God? Jonathan believed nothing keeps the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. So let's just get going. We have enough details to make a decision. The point of this event in Israel's history was to remind them that the Lord was still all that they needed. Whether they had a strong prophet, priest, or king, whether the nation was wealthy or poor, whether they were surrounded by enemies or supported by allies, the only thing that mattered in the end was if the Lord was with them. Throughout their nation's history, they had seen this and learned this time and time again. Generations earlier, for example, the Israelites were on the run from their Egyptian slave masters, only to get stopped by the Red Sea. And this is what Moses, their leader, said to them. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So I could summarize the big idea of this passage this way, which we can apply to our lives today. That because nothing can stop the Lord from saving, we can take small steps of faith through the biggest problems of life. Because nothing can stop the Lord from saving, we can take small steps of faith through the biggest problems of life. This firm conviction empowered Jonathan to take small steps of faith toward problems that seemed impossible for him to overcome. And that's how we'll unpack this big idea, by noticing 3 small steps of faith that led Jonathan to courageously take action while Saul anxiously sat around. In his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins and his team of researchers learned the factors that separate great companies that last over generations and other companies that are flash in the pan. While some students in business school might think that everything rises or falls on whether or not they can come up with the next big idea, in examining the history of visionary companies, Jim Collins writes that he and his team were, quote, struck by how often great companies made some of their best moves, not by strategic planning, but rather by experimentation, by trial and error, by opportunism, and sometimes, quite literally, by accident. What looks in hindsight, he says, like a brilliant strategy, was often the residual result of an opportunistic experimentation and, quote, purposeful accidents. For example, he goes on to recount how baby powder unintentionally grew to become 44% of Johnson & Johnson's revenues. Or how Marriott restaurants went out of its way to see if a partnership with airports could be profitable after they noticed that one of its restaurants that happened to be close to an airport attracted passengers on the way to catch a flight. Soon, they were delivering prepackaged boxed lunches directly to the tarmac. They had to put a full-time manager in charge of this project and eventually reached more than 100 separate airports with this idea. They conclude, Jim Collins concludes, this step looks brilliant in retrospect, but in reality, it was simply the result of an opportunistic experiment that happened to work out. This is similar to Jonathan's first step of faith. He simply says, let's go over to the Philistine garrison. Commentator Richard Phillips writes this, that Jonathan had no definite plan. He simply went out to look for an opportunity to take action. This is what I call getting into orbit. Rather than drifting aimlessly like an asteroid in space, Jonathan got in orbit to see if he might get pulled into the gravitational pull of something productive. This was his first small step of faith. Get into orbit. Just get into orbit, you aimless asteroids. If all we need is an excuse to sit around and do nothing, we'll find one. Because the fact is, there will always be challenges we face. There will always be reasons to worry. There will always be excuses we give for not having what we need in our personal lives or in our church to do what we want to do. But God calls us to get into orbit. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 23. There is profit in all hard work, but endless talk only leads to poverty. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 and 16. Be careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. And how do we do this? He says, making the most of every opportunity. Now for you cautious types in the room, who need all the details before he can make a decision. Don't worry, there is a method to the madness here that Jonathan employed. He was not simply following his nose wherever it goes. Do not think that Jonathan was on this extreme end of the spectrum of decision makers who went out without any information. There was actually a critical piece of information Jonathan had, which informed his decisions to take and empowered him to take this first small step of faith. Even though there were still many other details that Jonathan hadn't figured out. He says, come on, let's cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. Here it is. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Although it may seem on the surface like Jonathan was living out this maxim, carpe diem, seize the day, right? Just assert yourself and good things will happen. This is not what Jonathan was doing. It's not seize the day, but it's seek the Lord who made the day. It's not your day to seize, for this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. This is the second small step of faith that Jonathan takes. Offer yourself to the Lord. Offer yourself to the Lord. We see this in verse 6. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Rather than waiting until his plan was all mapped out, Jonathan knew enough just to get into orbit, to see if he might get pulled into the gravitational force of something the Lord was already doing. And I thought this strategy was actually going to not get me this job when I was being interviewed. When I was being interviewed, one of the first questions I was asked by the church search committee was, how would you lead us to serve our community? This is an important question. It's part of the calling of our church, to love our neighbor as ourselves, just share the gospel, to meet needs. And I just had to be honest with them and risk everything and say, I have no idea how I'm going to lead you to serve your community because I don't know your community and I need some time to get to know the community, to see what needs we might actually find. Let's be come in with some prepackaged program or idea that's completely irrelevant and out of touch with the actual situation. Thankfully, that didn't deter them from being confident in my leadership abilities. And they gave me the time and space to lead. Well, this is what happened the day before I got offered the job to come here. I got my CDL license to be a school bus driver. And the reason I was getting my CDL license to be a school bus driver because I was worried I wasn't going to have a job. So I needed something to do. So I think, oh man, I kind of wasted that, all this training. I just got offered this job. Let's move down. Well, it turns out the next lot to this church is where they park all the school buses for the town of Sandwich. So after a little while of kind of marinating here, I asked for permission. How would you guys feel if I had a part-time job just for fun to be a school bus driver in the town of Sandwich? And the elders of the church were willing, although they were skeptical at first, they were willing to let me try it. And that's what I still do to this day. I'm a substitute school bus driver for the town of Sandwich. Why did I do that? It was not a missional strategy. It's because I had my license. And the buses are right there. I have 2 jobs now and I walk to both of them. This is a layup. And we'll see what the Lord might do there. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Right? And how many amazing relationships and stories can I tell you about bus drivers? You know what? Once a month, when the bus drivers do our annual training hours, they do it in the seats you're sitting in right now. All the bus drivers in town of Sandwich are in this church now. Once a month. They have to be here. And sometimes, every once in a while, a bus driver will come themselves. They have a community chaplain that they know and love. And I just get to enjoy zipping around town and getting to meet all the kids from kindergarten to 12th grade by the end of the year. So this is just getting in orbit. It's very simple. You don't have to have this big strategy. Just get in orbit. Perhaps the Lord will do something with it. Old Testament commentator David Sumora writes that when Jonathan says, perhaps, it's not a sign of Jonathan's doubt in God's ability, but rather a confession that God is not required to act for them. Notice Jonathan's modesty here when he says, perhaps the Lord might help us. Contrary to the word of faith movement, where some people believe all you need to do is believe, and the Lord will give you whatever you claim by faith, Jonathan knows better than to think like that, as if the Lord is at our beck and call. As a matter of fact, we'll see Saul try to fumble with a similar approach the Israelites had in an earlier battle against the Philistines, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 4. The Lord does not exist in order to glorify us in our personal endeavors in life. It's the other way around. We actually exist for God's glory. Here, Jonathan is not trying to make believe the Lord is going to do something, nor is he trying to manipulate the Lord into doing something for him. Jonathan is the one seeking the Lord in order to join the Lord in what the Lord is doing. Rather than Saul, who's sitting around anxiously wondering, Lord, when will you show up? Jonathan is pursuing the Lord, asking, I wonder if he's already at work and I can join him where he's at. When we put ourselves in orbit, we are searching for the gravitational pull of the Lord's providence. Providence is a theological term that refers to the Lord's work through ordinary circumstances of everyday life. This is in contrast to the Lord's extraordinary work or supernatural work. When the Lord invades the ordinary circumstances of everyday life through things like miracles. Through the Lord's providence, he's at work in the ordinary circumstances of everyday life. We see an example of this in Psalm 104. Psalm 104 says, the Lord causes grass to grow for the livestock, and he provides crops for man to cultivate, producing food from the earth, wine that makes human hearts glad, making his face shine with oil, and bread that sustains human hearts. This is why Jesus taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. Why? Because the Lord is in the ordinary, daily bread kind of business. Because the Lord is at work even through the ordinary circumstances of everyday life, we shouldn't be surprised, but we should actually rather expect to feel the gravitational pull of the providence of the Lord as we go about our day. We should be living and walking with our spiritual eyes wide open, expecting to see what the Lord might do through us, rather than waiting around until we have a plan. Let's just get into orbit and see if we get pulled into something the Lord is already doing. Now, although we would prefer for the Lord to speak to us directly, and most importantly, audibly, we still aren't left aimlessly wandering or clueless as to what the Lord is doing. And this is what we see in Jonathan's third small step of faith. Trust but verify. Trust but verify. This is in verse 10. He says, this will be our sign. President Ronald Reagan's phrase, trust but verify, was a foreign policy principle he used during negotiations with the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The term actually comes from a Russian proverb that President Reagan liked to quote when dealing with the Russian leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. The idea was simple, but it was strategic. The U.S. would extend trust in agreements, but would also insist on concrete steps for verification, such as inspections and monitoring, to ensure that the Soviets were truly keeping their word. President Reagan used it most famously during the signing of a treaty in 1987, where he stressed that peace and arms reduction could only be sustainable if both sides were accountable. So in essence, trust but verify was Reagan's way of balancing diplomatic good faith with practical safeguards. This is a third small step of faith that Jonathan took. Trust but verify. Jonathan trusted the Lord could work through him despite the circumstances. Yet he also made sure to verify what he should do was actually something the Lord was leading him to do. We see this back in verse 8 and following. Look back at verse 8 again. Jonathan replied, we'll cross over to the men and let them see us. If they say, wait until we reach you, then we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we'll go up, because the Lord has handed them over to us. That will be our sign. Why did Jonathan think this would be a sign of the Lord's leading? I'm actually not really sure. Scholars disagree about what Jonathan might have been thinking. Some think that it was likely Jonathan combined his request for a sign with some military savvy. If the Philistines were to allow Jonathan to come up into their midst, into the narrow and difficult path, then he might have a chance to deal with them one by one in a place where numbers could yield little influence. But other scholars think the exact opposite. They say Jonathan's plans for fighting the Philistines defied all military logic. The plan was so absurd that if it did succeed, it could only be because the Lord had given them into their hands. Either way, let's not go on an adventure missing the point. Jonathan trusted the Lord could work through him despite his desperate situation. Yet he also made sure to verify if what he was doing was actually something the Lord was leading him to do. This may be an encouraging note for us who are nervous about being optimistic for no reason. Jonathan was courageous and optimistic, And this attitude was fueled by solid reasoning and verified by practical signs. Jonathan did demonstrate great faith. Yet for however bleak his chances might have seemed, it wasn't a blind faith. You see, there's a difference between asking the Lord for a random sign and asking the Lord to verify his will through his providence. Seeing the Lord's providence unfold before us is one of the ways we are able to verify his leading in our life. This is where we might hear Christians talk about, quote, hearing from the Lord or being led by the Spirit, which is a good thing. Here's actually an example that was worked out in my own life and ministry very recently. I have a desire in my heart to revamp the whole church basement, renew the children's ministry space, let it be a place where people can go down and realize, oh, human beings are supposed to be here. This is a fun place to go with our friends and enjoy time fellowshipping with the church. We have NA groups that use our basement. I have a bunch of reasons why I'd love to renovate and revamp, refresh the church basement. But $12,000 later, there's this issue. We have a small church budget. So I have a decision to make. What do I do with this desire, this personal desire in my heart? I'm praying for the Lord to ask to provide. Do we ask the church, hey, let's do a capital campaign to raise money. Let me try to sell this idea. There's many fine ways to go about trying to solve this problem. But then it occurred to me, this might not be what the Lord wants us to do at all right now. What if this is very distracting? What if this be misuse of our funds? What if? Is there a way, Lord, you could verify this desire? Sure enough, a few weeks ago, somebody came to me at random and said, I want to give an anonymous donation to the church. They don't know anything about this idea, by the way, which happens to be exactly the amount of money it would cost for my personal dream, to come to fruition. That doesn't mean I'm in the clear, though. I still have to ask and honor this person. Is there any particular way you would like to see your donation being used to help the church? They said, well, it comes from a person who was an interior designer. Oh, that's very interesting. Let me share with you my dream. What do you think about that? They thought it was a great idea. Now, I still have to ask the church about this a little bit. And I do want to hear your thoughts. But do you see how the Lord verifies? He's able to verify the desires of our heart. It's a great grace of God to work through providence. I don't need a random sign. I need to pray, keep walking in faith, trust the Lord, use the counselors he's put in our life, continue to submit myself under the structures of authority that I'm under, and see if the Lord might be pleased to help us. Praise God that although he calls us to walk by faith and not by sight, he sometimes graciously verifies his leading in our life. Now, I believe Jonathan illustrates for us here the purest example of the most famous verse from the book of Proverbs, chapters 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Or what about Psalm 37, verse 4 and 5? Does this sound like Jonathan to you? Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. Well, after seeing these three small steps of faith that Jonathan took, should any of us wonder if Jonathan would find success or be amazed to hear about the great victory that he found? Jonathan and his armor bearer kill 20 Philistine soldiers. Word quickly spreads, and it terrifies the entire Philistine army. While this is happening, an earthquake erupts beneath them, playing toward the Philistine superstition of the gods of a particular nation fighting for them with divine power. Yet there was something to it, for the author, the biblical author, is happy to attribute this to the Lord. Though Jonathan and his armor bearer surprised the Philistines with their fierce attack, it was the Lord who brought terror on the Philistines, such that they were so confused in their panic, they were blinded by the fog of war and ended up killing each other with all the weapons that they were hoarding, right? They were battling, they were thinking they were battling their enemy. This great confusion displayed the Lord as the God of great reversals. He is the God of great reversals. Do you remember this theme? This is the grand theme over the whole book of 1 Samuel. He is the God of great reversals. Though the Philistines assembled together with an organized strategy in war, by the end they were scattered in panic and confusion. Jonathan was right. Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether he was working with a lot or whether the Lord is working with a little. This undergirded Jonathan's courage to step out in faith in the first place, and it's what sharply contrasted him with his father, King Saul. Now, if we are watching 1 Samuel chapter 14 as a movie, which one day it might be made a movie, that's a thing nowadays, I guess, everyone's making movies about the Bible stories. What do you think chapter 14, verse 3 would look like and sound like if we were watching this as a movie? Let's look back at verse 3 again for background on Saul. Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, was also with Saul. He was the son of Ahitub, the brother of Ichabod, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh. It doesn't sound like much, does it? It sounds like some just random, spurious details. But it's in these moments that a director would darken the scene and add low, ominous music. This is how they frame a character as suspicious or evil and cause us, their audience, to expect something to go terribly wrong, even though we might not even realize why we even feel that way. This is what the biblical author is doing in his writing, and why he would make these unusual and seemingly irrelevant background details. If you remember, Eli was the priest who raised and trained Samuel as a young boy. If you remember from last year in 1 Samuel chapter 4, Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, whom the Bible refers to as scoundrels. We read how they abused their position as priests in every way imaginable, and the Lord judged them through an untimely death against the Philistines, where the Ark of the Covenant was stolen, and the glory of the Lord departed from his people the day that Ichabod was born. So now here in chapter 14, this is an ominous note. The scene is darkening behind him, linking the failed priestly line of Eli with the pending failure of Saul's family line of kings that now we have to expect with this background. Consider how this passage again shows a contrast between Saul and Jonathan. Saul had the priests with him as well as the holy artifacts, but he suddenly discovers everything starts without him, so he rushes to call the priests, but he sees things moving so quickly, he just changes his mind and skips a step altogether. I actually really identify with Saul here. The day our daughter was born, we were planning on doing a home birth. We had this whole nursing crew that was going to come in, and they did a great job. They did checkups for months. We were very excited about it. We had friends who had used this group. We had never done a home birth before. We're not like that. We were just giving it a try. It worked out great. But this is what happened. Our daughter came so quickly. I was trying to get the birthing tub set up, while she's in labor, and I'm trying to fiddle with this thing and put on, turn on the hose and get the connector. And why isn't the pin going? And Catherine's like, forget about the stupid tub. I need to get this baby out of me. I'm just a clueless husband, like, what am I supposed to be doing? I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm zipping around back and forth, not wondering if I'm in the right place. Saul shows us this picture of complete incompetence for the moment. Saul the king is completely incompetent, handling the things of God, preparing himself for battle, and leading his people as their king. Instead of taking small steps of faith, Saul leaps into doubt and anxiety. Instead of getting into orbit, Saul stays put. Instead of offering himself to the Lord, Saul gives himself over to anxious reactions to what the Philistines are doing. And rather than trusting but verifying the Lord's leading, Saul tries to hire out the Lord's leading by deploying the priests and artifacts as he saw fit. Meanwhile, Jonathan is alone with his armor bearer, yet he's able to consult with the Lord just fine. Jonathan discovers the Lord's will with certainty, in fact, and is emboldened to engage in battle with a plan, and he finds incredible success. As much as you or I might aspire to be like Jonathan, and might even prefer to think of ourselves as Jonathan, you know that we're just a bunch of Sauls in here, right? We stand around anxiously when the Lord has called us to act. And when we make a move, we only turn from the Lord after life overwhelms us, proving we didn't know what we were doing at all. On the one hand, we might not believe the Lord is needed for all of that saving that we pursue in life. And on the other hand, we might be crippled with fear of all the things we think do keep the Lord from saving. Either way, we so often resist humbling ourselves under the Lord's power and authority and ability to work in our lives. In his book, Knowing God, J.I. Packer writes this. He says, this, at bottom, seems to be what's wrong with us. We are afraid to go all the way in accepting the authority of God because of our secret uncertainty that he's going to look after us if we do. But there's good news for us today, for us clumsy Sauls, as we see at the very end of our passage. So look back one last time in our passage to see this good news that Saul gets and you and I get. Verse 22. When all the Israelite men who had been hiding in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they also joined Saul and Jonathan in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day. Look at this final image here. It's pretty cool. It looks like a Lord of the Rings film. Saul and Jonathan side by side, washing through the orcs. The same Saul we were just watching, fumbling around. When reading through this passage, I took great comfort and assurance and hope for myself, seeing Saul's name included in the end credit scenes of this victory. The final wave of battle shows Saul and Jonathan fighting side by side, and it concludes, the Lord saved Israel that day. The Lord's victory is so great and expansive, it sweeps up bumbling, clumsy people like Saul to enjoy it just as much as Jonathan. You see, even the Sauls of this world get swept up in the Lord's victory. Truly nothing and no one can keep the Lord from saving, whether people who have strong faith or people who have weak faith. And here's why. The reason people like you and me, who have faltered and failed and stumbled and bubbled in and out of obedience to the Lord, the reason why we can get swept up in his victory nevertheless is because there was one who followed simple steps of faith in his life in our place, in order that we ourselves might be saved. Can you imagine having that kind of substitute? You don't get what you deserve. You get what Jesus earned for you. You get swept up in his victory. Get brought near to the Lord. This is how much of a bumbling fool I know that I am. It hits you every time. If you read through the Gospels, think about how Jesus walked his life. He walked his life in perfect obedience. We know that. But did you know how simple his faith was? How simple the steps that he took was. It's not very complicated. First, this is a silly theory, but if there was anybody who didn't need to pray ever, it would have been Jesus, right? And yet prayer regularly marked his life. Both spontaneous prayer and planned prayer. Both public prayer and private prayer. Jesus, why are you praying so much? You of all people don't need to pray. I need to pray. I need a prayer calendar. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness by the devil while fasting for 40 days, how did he overcome such great experience of temptation? Surely he recruited some eternal divine power to aid him, but no. He used what was available to each and every one of us. He drew upon simple commands and promises from God from his word. And in the garden, the night before his crucifixion, Jesus submitted himself to the Father's will rather than trying to manipulate his Father toward his own will or ultimate plan. Jesus needed to pass through these trials in order to live a perfectly obedient life and faithful life before the Father, so that he could give himself over as a substitute in our place. And yet the way that he accomplished so great a salvation was by walking simple steps of faith. And now, because of Jesus, even clumsy failures like us can get swept up in his victory and included in the end credit scene. We can be saved through Jesus' work and brought near to God, whether we have great faith or little faith. Whether we have many good works or little good works. Whether we live a life of great courage or crippling anxiety before the Lord. Because Jesus lived a perfectly obedient and faithful life before the Lord in our place, we can be saved despite what we can or can't bring to the table. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It's a gift from God. It doesn't come as a result of works, so that no one may boast before him. Titus chapter 3, verse 5. He saved us, not by works that we've done in righteousness, but according to his mercy. Romans 5, 6, and 8. While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Surely nothing and no one can stop the Lord from saving. Thanks be to God.